Hello and welcome to the Rogue Monkey podcast. We're the show that shares stories and insights from different people all around the world. Our hope is to give you inspiration to challenge yourself as we explore fascinating journeys from people in the world of sport to business, from arts to extreme adventurers, with previous guests including the captain of the Red Arrows, Netflix producers and Olympic champions. It's our final episode of 2021 and we're really proud to have now reached our 60th show. A huge thank you to you, our listeners all around the world, for sticking with us. And please stay tuned, as in 2022 we've got so many more new episodes and exciting guests lined up. Just before we share today's conversation, just a quick reminder to give us a follow on social media to keep up to date as we continue to share lots of inspiring content. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook and LinkedIn, all the links to which are in the show notes. For today's conversation, we're exploring an area that has been well beyond my understanding for a while now. And we're seeing it in the news more and more about cryptocurrencies, blockchain and the latest phenomena, NFTs. Our guest today is Chris Bruno, CEO and founder of Social Inc., a marketing agency that specialises in the world of blockchain. Now, this may have you already thinking that today's conversation is going to be way over your head, but the way in which Chris articulates his views takes us on a journey that really does give us an understandable insight into the newest wave of technology that will change the world. So here we go with episode 60 of the Rogue Monkey podcast. Chris Bruno, exploring blockchain and the wider tech revolution. A conversation about what the future could look like. Hi Chris, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Very good. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, really looking forward to kind of getting into a rabbit warren of conversations with you. But if you can just give our listeners and viewers just a brief introduction as to who you are and I guess your headline summary journey so far.
Yeah, absolutely. So I set up a digital marketing agency back in 2008 after a succession of bad jobs with bad bosses. Decided I never wanted to work for anybody else again. So I set up and started doing something myself. That was back in, so 13 years ago in Gibraltar, where I was living at the time. And I ended up getting involved massively with the community, built an online television channel, worked with government, did all sorts of very cool stuff whilst we were there. And then in 2014, I moved back to the UK, carried on, decided to move the company over back to the UK as well. And in the last 4 years, we've specialized in working with blockchain companies. So we've been very lucky to work with some regulated stock exchanges that entered into the crypto space. We've worked with crypto ICO tokens, as people have probably heard of from back in 2017. And obviously at the moment working with a lot of NFT projects as well.
Okay, so plenty of words in there that I'm sure a lot of our listeners are like, what? So in layman's terms, when it comes to the whole blockchain space that is really exploding at the moment, and no doubt over the next 5-10 years will go absolutely mad. Number one, how did you get into that in terms of what was your first, that could be an interesting area to go into. And two, in layman's terms, how do you understand the space when you're an outsider, if you like, looking in?
Yeah, so I was quite lucky. I was asked by somebody that I knew who was working for a stock exchange to help out with some online marketing, the usual stuff, social media content, etc. And as we were talking to them, they were like that, we're looking at moving into the blockchain space and we want to do this, this and this. And at that point, I had heard about it. Obviously, there was rumblings. Unfortunately, I didn't buy a ton of Bitcoin when it was, $300 a piece or whatever it was back then. But the interesting part was I was like that, I can really see what the benefit of this technology is. To break it down in the most simple terms, blockchain can be likened to a database. So we all know what databases run everything that we basically use online, any systems or anything else. But what's nice about it is every time an entry is added, it can never be taken away. So it creates what we call an immutable record, because literally it's blocks going one on top of the other. So that record can never be manipulated, changed, or no one can go in and kind of quickly hide some money, for example, or anything like that. All the transactions, everything that happens is on there. And what that creates, obviously, with that immutability is something that's super solid and very, very transparent. And that's a game changer, right? When we think about the amount of banking scandals there have been, or the amount of dodgy Ponzi schemes that have been announced and all of these things, it's because so much happens behind closed doors. So suddenly being able to create something that's one, immutable, and then the second part of it being it's public. So if you want to, you can go onto ETHScan for the Ethereum blockchain network. You can literally look for any particular wallet, a particular transaction, see where it went from, who it went to, what the actual transaction was. And all of those elements make it something that's very, very powerful. If anyone has been listening, or anyone listening to this has ever used Sage, it uses the same principles, but still built on a normal database that can be changed. But in Sage, if you make a mistake in your accounting, you can't simply delete the last thing you did. You have to create a reverse transaction which stays on that record. This is basically like that, a ledger, but it just takes it to the next level. I hope that helps in layman's terms.
It does, and it's a space I'm very, I wouldn't, nervous is not the right word, probably more excited and curious to get into, because it's permeating so many different aspects of society. So it doesn't matter whether you're interested in art or Pokemon or gaming or, I was talking to somebody the other day and we were describing it around Tesco's club card points. So I was like, you do understand, like, something that's a nothing can have a value because of the way it's set out. And it's been a really interesting thing as it's becoming more commonplace in like language. And then suddenly you see a tester saying, oh, we'll accept that as a purchase for a car. And it's like, what? But it doesn't technically have any value. It goes, well, it does, but you need to kind of get your head around it all. So it does feel like an exciting space, perhaps maybe in the late 90s when people were talking about this thing called the internet, and they were like, I still can't really get my head around what it's actually going to look like. And they're like, seriously, it's going to be amazing. We're just not there yet. And I do feel like that's where we're getting towards with this.
There was a lot of people, literally, I think it was last week. I saw this on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and they basically had found an old photo of the headlines in 1980. I want to say 88. I don't remember. So if anyone pulls me up on this, I apologize. But basically, the headline of the article was people giving up on the internet. And literally, it was because at the time, one, the barriers to entry were huge. If you think back to when I was a little kid or whatever else, our first PC was a big thing. Having a PC in the house was a big deal. Not only that, you then needed a massive router that cost a small fortune at the time. You had dial-up internet, which was shockingly slow. And basically the ability to interact with the internet was fairly limited. So it meant that, the way we kind of think of the internet now, or the way this generation is growing up right now with the internet all beautifully skinned as an app on their phone, and you click 3 buttons and double click to pay and Face ID and all this stuff, it just didn't exist. So when you were going into forums or chat rooms or whatever it was 30 years ago, it was a very different and a very cumbersome, clunky experience. And it's something that people don't realize right now. Crypto still feels very much like that. The blockchain space still feels very much like that. There's pain points and barriers to entry, which are keeping a lot of people out. So setting up your own wallet, for example, becomes something that people look at, they start getting involved in because they're excited. And then by the end of like stage 4 of setting up the wallet, they go, Jesus, I just don't want to get involved in this. This is just too complex. And then they get given these 12 secret words that if you don't write them down somewhere, but if you lose them and then forget your password, you can never get back in, or all of these kind of elements. All of that's going to change. It's getting better. It's getting easier. People are understanding it more. And it's clear now, I think, for everyone to see and sit there and say, well, Bitcoin today is offering huge amounts of value and is a huge exchange of value for a lot of people around the world. But in the same way as that's just one small part of it, the rest of what this technology can do for logistics, having a completely immutable record of containers, for example, for shipping all around the world, and being able to see exactly what container went where, from what country, where it arrived, where it went to next, what boat it was on at the time. All of these sorts of systems, having an immutable record of it is really, really an asset for industries that haven't really looked at this before. So there is no more fiddling the books on the back end of the scene. There's no more we can pretend and say, yes, we've delivered 95 containers, when people can log on and say those 95 containers are still in the original port and they haven't left yet. There's 1,000 ways that we can actually implement this technology. And I think that's what makes it really exciting.
It must be really interesting, because when you listen to entrepreneurs talk, especially about envisaging something that doesn't exist yet, it's fascinating to, if you go back to the early days of the space stuff with, Branson and Musk and those guys talking about, there'll be one day where people will pay to go to space, and you're like, don't be ridiculous. And now we're watching Netflix documentaries where you can pretty much do that. And it's it's having the mindset, not just of the technology, but the peripheral services that are going to sit around that. So if I go back to my very layman's terms club card example, in the old days, you scanned your barcode, and once every 3 months or 6 months, you got a token through the post that had another barcode on it, and you go to the till and you'd scan it. You now open up the app on your phone, you can contactless it at the till. You can get home and go, oh, I've got this many points. I quite fancy going out for dinner tonight. Let's change the value of that into pub vouchers. Go to the pub, show them another code, which they scan, and you walk out and you've kind of not paid the bill, even though you have. And it's that applied to everything, especially when you're talking about integration of database systems, because it doesn't matter what line of work you're in, you store data and information on what you do. Now, 99.9% of companies have a filing system, and certainly a lot of the more outdated, I used to work at a school where we quite literally had filing cabinets everywhere, and every single child had a file. And we talk about that like it was 1,000 years ago. That wasn't that long ago, and there's probably a lot of places still doing that. What you're talking about now isn't that far away. So it's then thinking about, right, if that's going to be what the world we're going into next, what's going to sit around that? Well, the marketing associated, the security associated, the branding associated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the technology, for example, when it comes to payments, contactless and all those sorts of things. So it's starting to think beyond, well, this is a cool bit of tech that in a few years might be able to do X, Y, and Z. Well, if it can do X, Y, and Z, what do I need to, as a business, set myself up for so that I can offer those services? And how's your head got into that space? Because that's really forward thinking. Whereas a lot of businesses go, there's a need, therefore I'll do it. Not there's going to be a need in the next 5-10 years, therefore I'm going to start now.
It's really interesting because you have these little light bulb moments along the way, I think. And I remember talking to someone about 5 years ago. This chap's done remarkably well. He helped a government basically implement regulatory framework for blockchain technology. So he understands the space and everything else. But we were talking one day and there was somebody else in the conversation who was saying, I don't get it. This tech, one thing or another, what's it going to do? Why is it going to change the world? And it was like that. Right. We all have to now distinguish between understanding and using tech. So for the vast majority of people, they have no clue how tech actually works, right? If you say to someone, right, okay, so Uber, they're like that. Yeah, it's a great app. I completely understand it. I can click a couple of buttons, a car arrives, it takes me to where I'm going. They take a payment. It's amazing. Awesome. What are the elements that actually go into that to make that piece of tech work? It's a huge technology stack that most people are just completely oblivious of. But what they want is that easy, I can use it, therefore it's a great piece of tech. When it comes to credit cards, and this was the example that was given that day, and I always remember it, and it was my light bulb moment, which was, somebody saying, well, okay, let's imagine blockchain and how we transfer value and one thing or another and all that, and what happens, and people trying to really understand that breakdown. And the guy just simply said, okay, when you use your credit card, how does that work? And it was that light bulb moment where I went, nobody knows how a credit card works. We tap a machine and therefore we paid using our credit card. And we're really happy with that. But the technology behind that, and even MasterCard, is it MasterCard or Visa now that have started doing adverts of, we're not a payments company, we're a network. And it's this idea of that whole ability to be able to transfer from A to B is a huge tech stack, once again, in the middle that nobody really understands, but that people love to use, and we use it every day, day in, day out. And this is a really key element where at the moment, because this is new, because it's nascent, because there are problematic stories, there are scammers, exactly the same as there are in every other part of our lives, right? On the internet, whether it's emails that you get from some African prince who wants to share $100 million with you, he just needs your bank details. The same thing is true in blockchain space. And let's not all forget as well, the number one means of, hiding illegal money and everything else still remains cash, which is a government provided thing. So all of these things play a part. But people at the moment really want to understand blockchain. When they try to, they can't understand the benefit of it because they're having difficulties understanding the actual technology. But if you actually ask someone, okay, so what happens when you tap your card? What does that transactional part look like once it's gone past the credit card point of sale machine? And how does that end up relating to you having money taken out of your bank account through a network that has nothing to do with your bank account, and taking that money to give it to somebody else into their bank account whilst taking a fee between it? And it might be in a different country, in a different bank. And how did that happen? That to me is like the light bulb moment of, yes, understand the tech if you're interested in that and if you really want to get involved. But if not, the actual underlying technology is different to the use cases and how it can be used. And once that friction kind of dissipates a little bit on the blockchain tech, and it becomes as easy as just opening an app and clicking a few buttons, more and more people will jump in on it and love what that can do.
Right, we've been recording about 10, 12 minutes, and that little point there on its own has completely changed my mind on it. So what we're talking about is outcome. What's the outcome we're looking for? And in the integration of tech in any aspect of life, what you're looking for is something that makes my life easier. Okay, because it's easier for me to be able to open my app with my club card points than it is to get the tokens that are wherever I put them. I think they're in that drawer, or they're in that drawer, that sort of thing. And when I get there, I don't want to have to rummage through my wallet and find them. I want to go bang, done. So it's usability. And then I guess the next step for that, as I talked around with those wraparound services that sit around that, use your credit card example. There's somebody who went, right, if we're all going to move to contactless, there's probably going to be a market, for example, for vending machine contactless readers. Now, a simple example of how that blew people's minds was I was working in sales about maybe 5 years ago now, when the new pound coin came in, and they had to do a massive upgrade on pretty much every vending machine in the country because it wouldn't take the old pound coin. And yet because of the acceleration of contactless through COVID and stuff like that, that's almost not even a discussion now. It's like, do I even own a pound coin? Because if I went out today, went to Tesco's, didn't take my wallet with me. Okay, now that's where we are now, and that's 2021 heading 2022. Thinking where it's going to be in 5 years' time, people can't get their head around that. So, as a business, how do you start looking, if you like, into the future? Do you have a crystal ball, or do you draw upon the experiences, I guess, of all the different businesses you've been in and your understanding of this sector, and then start applying where it might go next?
I think there's two things, right? No one has a crystal ball. So even if you look at the best investors, the VCs and everyone else, they'll all have at least one story of we passed on Uber. And you can just sort of see the regret in their faces, right? As they tell you that story. Everyone's the same. No one's going to get it 100% right. It depends on what your interests are, right? If you're completely non-technical, you have no real interest in tech whatsoever or anything else, jumping into the blockchain industry because you think that's where the money is probably going to be painful, right? There's a lot of understanding that goes in the back of it. But the same way as if you said to me, I'm not techie and I want to become a web designer, I'd be like that. This is going to be a challenge, right? I'm not saying you can't learn, but it's going to be a challenge because there's a lot of technical parts that go into the back end of that. And I think this is where the market space is right now. It's a very easy keyword to slap onto your Twitter profile and make a lot of noise about. But it's an industry that's evolving, one, at a pace that is just unbelievable. And I do mean unbelievable. Like every morning I'm reading and catching up and being like, that crap, I didn't know about this yet. Like, oh my God, there's another big change coming. And somebody announces something and you go, right, let's start looking at what's happening there and what they're trying to. But if you look at it, you can see the trend. So Warner Brothers has just done a collection of NFTs for the Matrix film, in tying that in with the release of the new Matrix film. And what an incredible kind of mashup, because NFTs, cool tech, all a bit futuristic, and Matrix, fantastic. So that's a new one that's just happened. But at the same time as that's happened, Budweiser just sold out 1,936 NFT versions of cans to kind of celebrate their heritage. And those sold out within an hour. Now, all of this is a completely new concept to most people. And they're like, that, why would I buy a picture that I can right click and save? And you've got to realize that that's not what we're talking about here. This technology has given us the opportunity to create wrappers around certain things, certain assets, and basically make them completely unique, identifiable, but more importantly, prove ownership. So if we took this example and forget about cans or pictures of apes or whatever else that people have probably heard of in the news, because these things are making a lot of noise. But if you take this and you play it out 10 years from now, our birth certificate, it's a one-of-a-kind document. It's completely unique only to us. And it's something that if you've ever had to grab your copy of your birth certificate and you don't have one, is an absolute pain to actually go off and find it and go through the government websites and click something. And then eventually somebody sends you a physical photocopy of your birth certificate, which goes in a file. And eventually you lose that one as well. And then you repeat the whole process and the whole cycle. But this is something that once issued is verifiable, because you can ring them up and they go into the old ledger books and they start flicking through the pages all the way back to the 80s, let's leave it at that. And basically, they then find that entry that said, you were born on this day. That's a ledger. That's literally what it is. And what blockchain technology is a distributed ledger. So we could make this into a system whereby everybody that's born gets issued their digital certificate, birth certificate, and that just goes up and up and up. And every time we have a new birth, that sits on top. And this becomes completely immutable. Nobody ever gets lost in the system or anything else. And it's completely there. But more importantly, it's a public record. So when you're applying for a job, if you need to be ID checked or verified who you are or whatever it is, people can access that, enter into it to just double check that that's actually exactly what you sent them, birth date and everything is correct. Done. They don't even need to know any other information. They don't need to see the birth certificate. They don't need any of this. They can literally programmatically just tag in, check that record, say, yes, that's approved. That is definitely the person who's saying it is, and come back out and say, tick, well done. And all of these sorts of systems is where this technology, I think, will end up going. This becomes a really different offering. The Gibraltar government has literally just announced this week that they're going to be implementing blockchain tech into certain parts of government organizations. This is an incredible way to start offering up real transparency from a government's point of view, but secondly, making everything super easy. We won't need to have third-party Experian or whoever it is to do credit checks and whatever else eventually, because, well, if all of that info is completely there and open and honest and accessible to the right entities in the right way, tax office can check it, the your employer can check it, your PAYE codes for tax reasons can be double checked. Everything can just be automated and in a way that's completely immutable, which I think is really important.
So as a business looking forwards then, obviously you've got to put yourself in the shoes, I guess, of all these companies out there, especially ones that sit in that tech space that are potentially going to be going into this world and thinking, I barely understand the tech. How the hell am I going to market this? And that's kind of where you position yourself to actually go, no, we get it. And we know what you do and you know what you do. So let's put those things together. So where do you see, I guess, the relationship, if you like, between businesses and traditional marketing agencies moving? Because in the old days, I, for example, go, right, I want to put out a tweet a day. I know my target audience, and I know a company that's really good on that sort of thing, so I'm going to go to them. Now, that's going to start to shift into a world where perhaps they almost don't understand the bit in between, but they still know they need to be into that space. So as a business, how are you shaping what you offer, but also, I guess, your knowledge and network so that you can get into a position where in 5 years' time, when they're putting their hand up going, help, you're going, I'm already ready for you.
So I think the key part here as well is everything has always basically been around communities, right? And if we still look at that, and if we play that out, what this technology is currently doing is creating, again, even more subculture kind of community right now. But every brand wants to figure that out and wants to get community right. They want people that are engaged with them. They want people interacting with them. They want people to be a part of their journey just as much, because that's how you get money, right? If you ask a Tesla owner, 90% of them are mad Elon Musk fans, stroke Tesla fans, and they will, protect and defend their Tesla decision to buy one till the end of the earth. And I completely understand that. A couple of weeks ago, I was very lucky having dinner with some friends, and one of these guys is a complete sneakerhead. Now, this is something that I'm aware of, but I wasn't massively informed about. Sneakers, as I did some research afterwards, sneaker industry is about $100 million a year, $100 billion a year, globally. But there's a $6 billion a year industry for second-hand sneakers. Second-hand. Now I'm thinking, okay, like second-hand in the sense of still in the box, purchased, kept, made sure they're maintained, look perfect, limited editions that came out in 99, let's say. And it's a pair of special edition Air Jordans that was in an off-white color. And these now are retailing for 200, 300,000 pounds. There's a whole culture subset in that. There's kids that are making thousands, and I mean tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars by having the hookup in this community, knowing when these limited edition pairs are coming out, probably doing some backhanded deals to make sure that they're getting them out the shop before they go on public sale, and so they don't have to sit in the queue. They're making YouTube videos with millions of views talking about these latest editions. They're doing resale swap meets and all sorts of stuff. That's a whole community and industry based off of the idea that a pair of shoes in limited edition is worth money in the future. Now, if you speak to my dad and say, Dad, I'm thinking of bidding 300 grand for a pair of shoes, I mean, he'd probably slap me, right? And be like, that, what are you doing, son? My first house only cost 15 grand or whatever it was. This is the difference. This is the position that we're in right now. So it's very easy to dismiss anything that you don't really know, don't really understand, that we're not really involved in, or that personally we think is crazy. And brands have to be very careful of that as well. Very easy to sit there and go, this blockchain stuff is rubbish. Bitcoin is nothing. Ethereum, what's that? Who cares? There's a whole subculture that is around this right now. The figures for Q3 for the NFT market, just the NFT market, was something along the lines of 15 billion in transferred value. Now, $15 billion, you've got to bear this in mind, right? It's nearly 3 times the secondhand sneaker industry. But NFTs, as far as most people are concerned, didn't exist a year ago. They've been around for about 4 years, but public domain, public interest growing in the last year. That's ridiculous. That's in a quarter. This puts this at a $60 billion potential yearly market if it doesn't grow at all. $60 billion. It's huge. There are things going on that if brands don't take on board, if they don't look at this now and say, right, we don't necessarily understand it, but we need to, we'll get the tech people in that can help us deliver this. There's lots of agencies out there that run the tech side of it. We'll get marketing people to help us understand how we build a community around that so that we've got really hardcore engaged fans. But in the future, it's going to be even more than that. The brands that don't get involved in this today and that are old school, that have been around for years and that don't change the way they do things are going to struggle, I think. The brands that come up now and that start brand new with nothing from nowhere, like Bored Ape Yacht Club, which has become one of the most exclusive online communities that you can get into now. I think the current price would set you about $400,000 to be able to enter this club by buying one of those assets. That has now generated a huge amount of money. Every time those assets are being resold, it's helping to fuel the economy of that organization. They're using that money to reinvest in events, more tech, more opportunities for their community. And you've now got the buy-in from people like Jimmy Fallon, you know, the Saturday Night Live show host in the US, who literally has joined that community. So there's people, you know, that were sat in their bedrooms buying these things for $400, I don't know, say a year ago or a year and a half ago, who suddenly are at a party with some of the most famous people in the world, with some of the biggest VCs, with some of the biggest tech startup people. And that just simply wasn't possible. And that's come from nothing. So imagine what sort of brands are going to be able to do, and new companies, new startups, when they fund the initial steps, when they give some control to their community, to their actual clients, where they start organizing in a way that actually puts their community really first, not just as a sentence on their website. That becomes hugely powerful.
So reflecting back, because as we mentioned earlier, kind of you're looking forwards in the sense of what's coming next. And you mentioned your light bulb moment, but drawing upon the skills across your career so far, what have been the continuous threads, if you like, that it didn't matter whether it applied to, for example, just social media marketing and understanding the value of social media, all the way through to the blockchain world and where it's heading next? What have been the threads that from the day you walked into the business door, if you like, all the way through to now, that have put you in good stead and you look back and think that was useful knowing that? Because these are the kind of things where I think people seem to think every single world operates in its own little bubble. And actually there are often threads that carry through from leading the business, the way you think, all of those sorts of things. So can you articulate any of those?
Challenging, but I'd say it's usually most things are principle based. Everything else is just wrappers and layers on top of that. But it still amazes me today. We'll talk to a company that's making millions of pounds and we'll say, awesome. And they'll say, you know, social media doesn't really work for us. And I'm like, that fantastic. What did you want it to do in the first place? You know, what were your goals when you set out to start doing social media and before you started spending 10 grand a month on it? And people go quiet. And I think, wow, you didn't actually set any goals. You didn't know what the KPIs were. You didn't actually know what you needed to do or what you wanted to achieve from that. You just threw money at the problem because you thought but we have to be on social media, right? And the rest is just a hope and a prayer, a bit like throwing the spaghetti against the wall to see if it's cooked. This kind of idea in business in general happens all the way through. And it's something that I always remember years ago, probably about 2010, 2011, just recognizing, going, Jesus, most people, even in their own businesses, don't know realistic lead times. You know, the amount of conversations we've had over the years where people go, we need fast wins. We need to get some clients in now. And you're like, that awesome. This sounds great. So on average, when you speak to a new potential prospect, how long does it take you before they actually sign on board? And they go, well, it's 6 to 9 months, you know, because it's a really expensive. So that's how are we going to get any quick wins? All of these little things actually form up the big image of the company. But the amount of people that don't run with the principle side of it, understanding the core fundamentals, being realistic about them, and understanding that whether it's social media, whether it's by doing NFTs, whether it's by creating a YouTube channel, whether it's a website, whether you do e-commerce or retail, all of these things don't matter. They're simply channels. And actually the underlying principles, whether it be for marketing, for business, for your sales team, for the KPIs that you want to set for yourself as a business, all of those things should underline everything that you're doing. And by looking at that and understanding those principles at the bottom line, you can then monitor really easily and say, I'm going to jump on a podcast with Kevin, but I know exactly why I'm doing this, because I want to have a chat with Kevin and because I was really excited about coming on the show, as opposed to me saying, I need to sell 500 units by jumping on this podcast. And you will have people that think that. And we've run a podcast for 2 years. I've had people come on board and going, it's really important that we share this link. Can you put this link up? I was like, that, yeah, by all means. But that's not how the world works, right? You're not going to go on one podcast and make 500 sales on the same day that it comes out. It's not realistic for 90% of projects. So I think understanding that, getting your real fundamentals for your business, and then understanding that everything else on top of that, for you, the same as it is for Disney, is just an experiment. You try, if it works and it goes well, great. If it doesn't, no worries, try something else.
Interesting. You mentioned Disney there, because I'm putting together a brand deck at the moment, and one of the things that came out of it was some examples of other businesses around authenticity. And in one of the big global surveys recently in that space, Disney came out as one of the highest reputable brands in terms of they're authentic at what they do, because they're very, very clear on what they're trying to achieve. How they go about it, some things they've done really well. Disney Plus is, granted, no one could have seen the pandemic coming, but it's no secret that being launched for a relatively cheap price during a time when a lot of people were sat at home struggling for things to watch, you know, it was a match made in heaven. And I think it's really interesting. Let's take your brand now looking forwards. What are those principles that you're putting in place to make sure that in 5 years, 10 years, you're thinking, right, we need to make sure that we're true to what our principles are, but also we're relevant to the world we're going into? Because it's like you say, it's terrifying how quick it's moving. You know, we were talking before we started recording about kids that aren't even legal age to work yet are earning more money than some CEOs in massive organizations, which you can't really get your head around. So yeah, how does that sit with you?
It's interesting. Like the Disney side of things is a really good example, like you said. And if you look back, Disney has been basically creating the same thing again and again and again for however many years it's been now, 60, 70 years or whatever. What's really interesting about it is then how it's developed since. So Disney could have easily sat there and gone, we're not getting into streaming. We don't believe in that as a new piece of tech. We're not interested in that. But actually, they've gone completely the opposite. They've started purchasing some iconic, incredible brands. So obviously acquiring Marvel, taking on Lucasfilm. So they've got the Star Wars collection, but not sitting on that and going, great, we're sorted now. We just keep pumping these out every Christmas and it's perfect. You know, we get royalties every time it goes on television or anytime Netflix wants to stream it or anything else. But they sat there and went, right, what do we do with it? And, you know, if you look at Marvel as an example, Marvel is the only project in a studio or any kind of film cinematography world where they have now created, and I can't remember what the number is, but it's about 30 films, feature length films, most of which have done phenomenally well at the box office, but they're all connected and they're still creating new shows connected to this, and they're making more, and there's more films coming. The new Spider-Man comes out. They've just announced 3 more Spider-Man films with Tom Holland. This is just an incredible snowballing effect of this Marvel world that's been created, which has never been done before. Now, think about how that plays out into the future and how they keep doing that. You've got all sorts of opportunities. They've already started with video games. There's mobile apps for this stuff. Then there's merchandising opportunities. Then there's cross franchises and advertising opportunities for all of this and everything else. But it always stands true that what they're sitting there saying is, look, we're going to create incredible content for people. We want them to enjoy it. We're going to make it as accessible as possible, which is something that's really important. And what does that look like going on in the future? In 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, are we still going to have Netflix, Amazon Prime, Apple TV, Disney Plus, or actually are we going to have 10 more? Do we need to have all these kind of subscription things, or will somebody end up becoming a bit more triumphant? We just don't know. But all of these things just keep moving forward with the technology, with the times, and you can tell that they've created something that's become a ridiculous community. There are millions, probably billions of Marvel fans out there in the world. And those people come together, they talk about it, they interact with each other, they discuss things. There's a whole subculture, like you talked about earlier, of like spin-off industries. So there's people literally making YouTube videos and creating their own incomes by simply talking about everything that's going on within the Marvel universe. And that's just now created a job and an income stream for somebody and doing something that just physically didn't exist beforehand. So I think all of this, watching this, is just going to be hugely fascinating as we keep going forward. And I don't know, there's some people working on a Spotify competitor on the blockchain, which would give, again, completely transparent and accessible records of who deserves what kind of royalties for the streaming revenues. Does the same thing happen for films eventually, or does somebody new come along and actually find a new way of crowdfunding to create new films, create new content, and then distribute that in a different way as well? It's going to be exciting to watch.
It is going to be really exciting, and it's it's really interesting talking to people who not just recognize that it's coming, are actually actively working in that world, because I think there's a difference between someone clicking on a BBC News article and going, oh, that's cool, and then in 3 years' time going, oh yeah, I saw something about that a few years ago, versus somebody who's going, right, this is coming and we're going to put ourselves in a place. So looking forwards, let's say 2025, you could have three things as a business that you think, if we can get to that place, and I don't necessarily mean revenues and clients, any of that sort of stuff, but in terms of your actual services provision, if you like, on what you're actually offering the wider audience out there, what would that look like as a goal for you in, say, 4 or 5 years' time?
For me personally, as opposed to for the company, we're currently looking and we're working with, so this is the first time I've said this in public, I think, currently working with a couple of NFT startups, a marketplace, a project, and some really interesting concepts. We really want to be involved more than just the marketing arm or the marketing agency. So we're trying to take a bigger stance in these things. We're trying to get more involved at an earlier stage to try and help build those projects, because we genuinely do see this as going forward, it's going to make a change. There's a lot of confusion out there. Web3, metaverse, Meta, the new name for the Facebook group of companies. People don't necessarily understand all this space right now, but this is going to be a faster shift and a faster, more accelerated, I think, shift from what we used to call Web 1 at the very beginning of the internet days, when it was a pain, to Web 2, which is what we all use today and we're all very familiar with, to what comes next, Web 3, which is being able to share the ownership or the organizational control or how decisions are made within an organization with your actual community and with the people that are actually buying your products in the first place. And this becomes a huge, huge opportunity. Again, if you look at it, concept and the underlying principle, still just community, but it's now actually rewarding that community. It's not rewarding your shareholders by fleecing your community. It's actually, why can't your community be, well, your shareholders and your clients? Doesn't that make it a more interesting prospect? And remembering again that a lot of people might not know this, but John Lewis and Partners, employee-owned businesses have been a thing before. Now we're just looking at what that next stage looks like. Maybe if every user of a social network owned part of the social network and received a part of the fee or whatever it is and got paid to actually use it and get the adverts that are served to them and everything else, maybe people would be a hell of a lot more interested and a hell of a lot less against Zuckerberg or whoever creates the next one. And that becomes a very interesting prospect as well.
That's really, really exciting. And then my final question is the complete opposite. So if you could go back to whenever that first seed was sowed about potentially going into the business world, but with, I guess, the wide eyes and the naivety of all that experience that you've now got, what would you go back and say to yourself?
Don't do it, run. No, joking. It is a tough journey, and I think there's a lot of preparation. It's something that my girlfriend keeps saying to me, and I think it's a really, really useful piece of advice, and it's don't sweat the small stuff. And it's incredible how much we get stuck in different parts. And when you're having a bad day and something's kicked off and you can't pull yourself away from it, but 90% of the time we can get focused or stuck into stuff that we just shouldn't be doing. So keep looking at it. Circle of influence, circle of concern is another way of putting it. But what can you influence? What can you change? Focus on that. Forget about everything else and just keep going on your journey.
It's a really nice way to put it all together, and a nice way to kick off everyone's, I guess, thought process moving into the new year, because I think 2022, we always have these ambitions of, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to try this and I'm going to learn this and etc. I'm going to start my own business. But actually, it's really exciting to talk to people who have immersed themselves in that space for a long time, but are also looking ahead at what comes next. So, Chris, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kevin.
Wow, a fascinating conversation there with Chris. He's so knowledgeable and passionate in this area, and I've no doubt we could have carried on for hours in this space. It does feel, as the year ticks over into 2022, that we're on the verge of some extremely exciting technological leaps. And as Chris said, whether we understand it or not, the impact of what this technology can do is most certainly coming. The tech stack example of payments is something that really resonated with me, as we've all gone through the last 2 years or so, almost transitioning to not even using cash, with not actually thinking about how contactless even works. That example applied to this new era of technology is something that really struck out as my light bulb moment from that conversation. Again, a big thank you to Chris for sharing some time with us. You can follow Chris on Twitter, where he shares plenty of insights on the space, so be sure to check out the link to his page in the show notes, and we've also included the link to the podcast that Chris runs. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today, and if you can spare 30 seconds, please give us a quick rate and review. We would really appreciate it. Our YouTube channel is growing, so make sure you subscribe to that as we keep sharing more new content. Coming up in the new year, we've got recordings with charity founders, leaders from the sports world, entrepreneurs and free thinkers from the world of education, just to name a few. Thanks again for joining us, and from all the Road Monkey podcast team, myself, Luke and Carter wish you a very great festive break and a happy new year.